The sun was shining brightly that afternoon, casting a warm glow over the city. Emily and I had decided to take a break from our busy lives and enjoy a leisurely drive. We didn't have a particular destination in mind, we just wanted to spend some quality time together, away from the usual hustle and bustle. As we drove, we chatted about everything and nothing, savoring the simple pleasure of each other's company. Eventually, we needed to refuel, so we pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town. While I filled the tank, Emily wandered off to stretch her legs. It was then that I noticed her. A young girl, perhaps 12 or 13, stood by the entrance of the gas station. Her clothes were worn and dirty, and her face bore the marks of hardship far beyond her years. She was holding a small, crumpled sign that read, "Need money for food. Please help." "Thomas, look at her," Emily said softly, returning to my side. She looked so lost and desperate. I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness in my heart. I remembered what it was like to feel helpless and alone, especially after my parents passed away. "I'm going to see if she needs help," I said, making up my mind. I approached the girl slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hi there," I said gently. "Are you okay? Why are you here begging for money?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "My name is Susan," she replied, her voice trembling. "My mom is an alcoholic and doesn't take care of me. I need money to buy food and survive." Emily joined us, her eyes filled with compassion. "Thomas, we have to do something for her," she urged. "She really seems to need help." I nodded, my heart breaking for the young girl. "You're right, Emily." Turning back to Susan, I said, "I'm going to get you a plate of food, okay?" Susan's eyes widened in disbelief. "Thank you so much," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I walked into the gas station and bought the heartiest meal I could find: a burger, fries, and a large soda. As I handed the food to Susan, she looked at me as if I had just given her a treasure. Emily stood beside me, her eyes filled with tears as she watched the girl devour the meal. "Here, take this as well," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out some money. "But tell me, what are you going to do with it?" Susan hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. "I'll hide it from my mom," she said quietly. "If she finds out, she'll spend it all on alcohol." Her words hit me hard. I couldn't imagine what it must be like to live in such a situation. On an impulse, I walked back to the car and retrieved the ring my grandfather had given me. It was a simple silver band, but it held immense sentimental value. "Thomas," Emily said softly, noticing the ring in my hand, "are you sure you want to give that away? Your grandfather said it should be used for special occasions." "Yes," I said firmly, feeling a wave of compassion wash over me. "I feel in my heart that it's the right thing to do. This ring can be a symbol of hope for Susan." I knelt down and handed the ring to Susan. "This ring is very special to me," I explained. "It was given to me by my grandfather. I want you to have it. Let it remind you that there are people who care about you, and that things can get better." Susan took the ring with trembling hands, her eyes wide with surprise. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank us," Emily said, her voice gentle. "Just take care of yourself, okay?" We stayed with Susan a little longer, talking to her and offering whatever comfort we could. Before we left, we gave her some more money and told her where she could find a local shelter that could help her further. As we drove away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. "I hope she'll be okay," I said, glancing at Emily. "Me too," Emily replied, squeezing my hand. "But I think we made a difference today. Sometimes, a small act of kindness can change someone's life." I nodded, feeling a warmth in my heart. Little did I know just how true those words would turn out to be. Growing up, my grandfather, Mr. Robertson, was my rock. After my parents died in a car accident when I was just a toddler, he took me in and raised me as his own. His home became my sanctuary, a place filled with love, wisdom, and the occasional tough lesson. Despite his advancing age, Grandpa Robertson managed to keep the house lively, filling it with stories of his past and dreams for my future. One summer afternoon, we sat on the porch, sipping sweet tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was one of those golden evenings where everything seemed perfect, yet I could sense a lingering sadness in his eyes. "Grandpa," I began hesitantly, "how do you feel knowing that your children don't care about you the way they should?" He sighed deeply, staring out at the fading light. "It's painful, Thomas," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But life has its ways. People make their own choices and follow different paths. Your aunts and uncle have drifted away, each consumed by their own struggles and priorities." I listened intently, trying to understand. But why, Grandpa? How can they just ignore you after everything you've done for them? He gave me a sad smile. Margaret is always worrying about money and her own troubles. Edward has his gambling problems, and Linda, she just wants to live her own life, free from responsibilities. They weren't always like this, but people change. Your mother, though, she was different. She was my joy, but she was taken too soon. Yet, she left me with the greatest gift you. I felt a lump in my throat. I'll always be here for you, Grandpa. You're the only family I've truly had. He reached out and patted my shoulder. I know, Thomas. That's what gives me strength. It's not about how many people love you, but about the depth of that love. And your love has always been enough for me. As the years went by, Grandpa Robertson's health began to decline. Despite his frailty, he never lost his spirit. I dedicated myself to taking care of him, knowing how much he had sacrificed for me. His resilience was remarkable, and miraculously, he recovered from a bout of illness that the doctors had deemed incurable. One evening, as we sat together in his study, he pulled out a small box from his desk drawer. Inside was a simple silver ring with intricate engravings. "This ring belonged to your grandmother," he said, his eyes misty with memories. "She gave it to me on our wedding day. When she passed, I kept it close, and now I want you to have it." I took the ring, feeling its weight and the history it carried. "Thank you, Grandpa. I'll cherish it always." He smiled, though his eyes were clouded with a mix of pride and sorrow. "Keep this for a special occasion, Thomas. It represents our family's legacy and love." His words stayed with me, a constant reminder of the bond we shared. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, I was left to deal with the aftermath. His other children, my aunts and uncles, showed up not to mourn but to claim their share of his estate. They hadn't visited him in years, yet they felt entitled to everything he had left behind. The day after the funeral, I was sitting alone in the house, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. The doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there stood Aunt Margaret, Uncle Edward, and Aunt Linda. "Thomas, we need to talk," Aunt Margaret said, her arms crossed and her expression stern. "As Mr. Robertson's children, we have the right to this house. You need to leave." I stared at them in disbelief. "How can you be so insensitive? I took care of Grandpa while you barely showed up. Now you want to take the house he left me." Uncle Edward, growing impatient, stepped forward. "It doesn't matter what you did, Thomas. We are his children, and the law is on our side. You have 3 days to vacate." Desperate, I sought help from a family friend who was a lawyer. "Mr. Harper, my aunts and uncle are trying to evict me from the house my grandfather left me. What can I do?" "Thomas, I understand your situation," Mr. Harper said sympathetically, "but the legal process is slow. I'll check if your grandfather left any will or document that might help you, but I can't guarantee we'll resolve this in 3 days." Feeling desolate, I thanked him and hung up the phone. The fight for the house would be tough, but I had no choice but to confront my relatives and defend my grandfather's legacy. Later that evening, Emily came over. She had been my rock through all of this, always there with a kind word or a comforting hug. "I'm so sorry, Thomas," she said, sitting beside me on the porch. "This isn't fair. You were the one who took care of him. You deserve to stay here." I nodded, feeling the weight of my sorrow and frustration. "I know, Emily. But they have the legal right, and I don't know if I can fight them." She took my hand, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll figure something out. You won't go through this alone." Her support meant everything to me. Despite the looming eviction, her presence gave me a glimmer of hope. Little did I know that an unexpected ally was about to change everything. 3 days later, I stood in the doorway of my grandfather's house, the only home I had truly known, waiting for what I knew was coming. The past few days had been a whirlwind of anxiety and desperate attempts to find a solution. Despite my efforts, the clock had run out. The sound of heavy knocks on the door echoed through the house, jolting me from my thoughts. I took a deep breath and opened it to find 2 police officers standing alongside a stern-looking woman who seemed vaguely familiar. She had a commanding presence, her uniform immaculate, and her expression professional yet compassionate. "Thomas Robertson?" she asked, looking directly at me. "Yes, that's me," I replied, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "I'm Officer Susan Carter. We're here to enforce the eviction order," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. As I stepped aside to let them in, something about her struck me. It was her eyes. There was a familiarity there that I couldn't place immediately. Then, my gaze fell upon the ring on her finger. My heart skipped a beat. "Susan, is that really you? The girl from the gas station?" Susan's eyes widened in surprise, and a warm smile spread across her face. "Yes, it's me, Thomas. I never forgot your kindness. It changed my life." Tears welled up in my eyes, a mix of relief and the overwhelming emotions of the moment. "I can't believe it's you. How have you been?" "It's a long story," she said, her voice softening. "But first, let's deal with this situation." Turning to the officers, she spoke with authority. "Please give us a moment." The officers nodded and stepped back, giving us some space. Susan then pulled out her phone and made a few calls, her expression one of intense focus and determination. After a few tense minutes, she hung up and turned to me. "Thomas, we have to follow the process for now, but I promise I'll do everything in my power to help you. This isn't over." Despite the uncertainty, her words gave me a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Susan. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied with a reassuring smile. "Just hang in there." That evening, with nowhere else to go, I found refuge at Emily's house. She welcomed me with open arms, her home a sanctuary amidst the chaos. "I'm so sorry, Thomas," Emily said as she led me to the guest room. "You can stay here as long as you need." "Thank you, Emily," I said, my voice choked with gratitude. "I don't know what I would do without you." "We'll get through this together," she assured me. "You're not alone." The next 2 days were a blur of legal consultations and emotional turmoil. Susan kept me updated on her progress, her unwavering support a beacon of hope in the dark. Then, on the 3rd day, she called me with surprising news. "Thomas, I need you to come with me," she said over the phone. "I found something that might change everything." Curious and cautiously optimistic, I agreed. Susan picked me up, and we drove to a modest house on the outskirts of town. When we arrived, an elderly woman greeted us at the door. "Thomas, this is Sophie Church," Susan introduced. "Your grandfather trusted her with something very important." Sophie smiled warmly and invited us inside. "Your grandfather and I were close friends," she explained. "Before he passed, he transferred the house and some of his most cherished possessions to my name, fearing that his children would try to take everything. He asked me to hold on to it until the time was right." I was stunned. I had no idea. Why didn't he tell me? "He wanted to protect you," Sophie said gently. "He knew how much this house meant to you and didn't want you to be caught in the middle of a legal battle." Susan handed me a folder containing the transfer documents. "These papers prove that the house legally belongs to Sophie. Your aunts and uncle have no claim over it." Relief washed over me, mixed with disbelief. "I can't thank you both enough," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "This means everything to me." "We're not done yet," Susan said, her expression determined. "We need to confront your relatives and make sure they understand they have no right to the house." We drove back to my grandfather's house, where we found Aunt Margaret, Uncle Edward, and Aunt Linda packing up his belongings. They looked up in surprise as we entered, their expressions quickly turning to anger. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" Aunt Margaret demanded. "You have no right to be here." Susan stepped forward, her voice firm. "Actually, he does, and you have no right to sell this house. I have a court order proving that the house was legally transferred to Sophie Church." Uncle Edward scoffed. "This is ridiculous. We're his children. This house belongs to us." "No, it doesn't," Sophie said, stepping into the room. "Your father entrusted it to me, knowing how you would behave. The law is on our side." Aunt Linda looked furious. "We'll fight this in court. You won't get away with this." "You can try," Susan said calmly. "But the evidence is clear. The house belongs to Sophie, and she has no intention of selling it." Defeated, my relatives had no choice but to leave. They tried to appeal the decision, but the court upheld the validity of the transfer, thwarting their plans. As they left, I felt a profound sense of justice and relief. Susan and Sophie had saved not just the house, but my connection to my grandfather's memory. Emily stood by my side, her support unwavering, and together we faced the future with renewed hope. That evening, as we gathered in the now secure house, I turned to Susan and Sophie. "I can't thank you enough. You both have given me more than just a house, you've given me hope." Susan smiled warmly. "Your kindness years ago changed my life. It was only right that I repay it." Sophie nodded. "Your grandfather was a wise man. He knew you would need help, and he made sure you would have it." As we sat together, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. I realized that the bonds we form and the kindness we show can have far-reaching effects, creating a network of support that can overcome even the toughest challenges. And with Emily, Susan, and Sophie by my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.